I'm so happy to be here. I am tuning in from Ohlone land, aka Oakland, California, the unceded territory of the Ohlone, Chichenyo speaking people. And I am so grateful to be here with Sha'Mira Covington to be talking about the history of cotton for Slow Factories Open Education Program. So we're going to try to cover a wide variety of information. It is not at all comprehensive. And at the end, we will leave ample time for questions. So take notes, write your questions down, use the Q&A function, use the chat, and we're going to get started with this class. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about sort of the way the growing sustainability movement and several brands have latched onto organic cotton, but leaving many questions about its history, farming, and processing unanswered. So today we're going to look at the origins of cotton, its relationship to colonialism, capitalism, commercialization, and of course the ongoing struggle of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples around the world. So is it even possible to do a history of cotton? Cotton is inherently a global story that ties together networks and identities across the planet over thousands of years, first through cultivation and then through violence, power, and dispossession. There is no way to do a true history of cotton as it is far too vast. So we're going to try our best to cover just a small percentage of the history of cotton. As you'll see as we go through this class today, there's so much more that could be covered. And so we want you to really look into the topics, the points about cotton that you find interesting. We will also send along some references afterwards if you want to explore more, but just know that this is a small lens into this vast, vast history of this plant. So we're going to start with the early origins of cotton and indigenous cultivation, which is really the largest piece of cotton history when you look at it from a perspective of geological time. So cotton plants have been growing on Earth for about 10 to 20 million years. Actually, geologists and biologists don't know how many millions of years, but what we do know is that cotton is one of the oldest plants that humans have cultivated on Earth, and it was first originating in the Indus Valley, in the Indus River Valley specifically, which is now modern day Pakistan, but it was domesticated independently and simultaneously in both the New World and the Old World. And in this case, the New World is the Americas, and the Old World is Asia and the continent of Africa and Europe as well. So what we know is that cotton is incredibly old and that indigenous communities around the world simultaneously found it to be a useful plant. So cotton is native to tropical and subtropical regions. If you look at this map here, which is on my right, you can see some of the regions that have the most tropical and subtropical areas. These are regions where cotton naturally grows and grows in the best of climates in these regions, sort of across the center of the earth on either side of the equator. The best conditions for growing cotton are really ideally no frost for most of the year. So cotton grows from about 160 to 200 days a year. And so ideally in the places where it grows best, there's no frost for most of the year. What that means is that temperatures should not really go below 50 degrees Fahrenheit and should be above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also my preferred temperature. I also feel like I'm a subtropical plant. So cotton really likes this tropical sort of temperate to warmer climate, and also it needs some rain. So minimum 20 to 25 inches of rain per year. And what we also know, especially in rainforests, is that they're both tropical and get a lot of water. So cotton has some of these sort of environmental conditions that are required, but large parts of the earth have these conditions. And so although cotton is incredibly specific for the type of tropical and subtropical conditions it needs, it's also incredibly adaptable. And that's why it was so widely domesticated by indigenous humans across the planet, across these tropical regions, because although they vary greatly, the plant is able to adapt if people cultivate it with the right care, intention, and understand their unique environment. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands, probably thousands of different varieties of cotton, and hundreds that were cultivated for the specific environments and geographies where they were grown. And so, what this meant is that the cotton plant looked very different in different parts of the world. So, maybe a farmer in Gujarat, India, would not recognize a cotton plant growing on the Pacific coast of Peru that an Andean indigenous person was growing. And so, although now we all recognize the cotton plant, thousands of years ago when indigenous humans were cultivating it, because they were only cultivating it for their specific region, the plant looked different. The stems were different heights, different lengths. The lint and the fiber was different texture, was different colors. There was brown cotton, white cotton, yellow cotton. So these varieties of cotton were mostly adapted to the different indigenous environments throughout the old world and the new world. So, what archaeologists believe is that people in the Indus Valley were the first to spin and weave cotton into fiber. Now, first is relative because we don't actually know, but what we know is that although it originated in the Indus Valley, that is also the place where we think cotton spinning originated. And so, the Indian subcontinent more broadly was the largest producer of cotton really until the 18th century. And what is now modern day India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan were the first indigenous communities to be spinning and weaving cotton. And so some of the processes used in this area was first they would remove the seeds with a roller gin. So they created a tool to remove the lint from the seeds. Then they used a bow to remove the dirt and the knots. So another tool was created for this other process. And then it was spun, the fiber was spun on a distaff, which is yet a third tool that was created specifically to spin the fiber, and then a spindle to make the thread, and then woven on looms, which are hung between trees or hung between little strong plants, as you can see in this image. And it was used for personal use, for clothing, to sell in local and regional markets, and it was grown alongside food crops. So already we're seeing that indigenous humans are creating tools and processes around making this natural plant into a natural fiber. And so, almost simultaneously, but a few thousand years later on the Pacific coasts, indigenous people independently also started turning cotton into fiber. One such group was the Aztecs, and the Aztec word for cotton is icatal. And the Aztecs would have been in what is modern day Mexico. And their process was a little different. Mostly, they separated the lint from the seeds by hand. They then beat it using like a mortar or something that they was strong and hard to beat it, combed it using another tool that was created, and then put it through a spindle to make thread. And so in this image, you'll see a sort of indigenous visual rendering of a woman spinning cotton thread in what would have been Aztec society. And it was also used for daily use. It was also used for armor. Aztec warriors are known for having very thick and ornate as cotton armor. It was used for exchange, for tributes to gods and emperors. It was used as a gift. And similarly to in the Indus River Valley, it was grown alongside subsistence crops such as maize. We go back across the globe to East Africa and then West Africa, which both developed their own cotton culture around this same time. There's about 100, more than 100 African languages that had a word for cotton as early as the 10th century. And so what we think is that most likely cotton was brought to North Africa through Islamic imperialism in the 8th century, and then it spread to East Africa and Southwest through trade routes and other types of expansion. And by the 11th century, West Africa was really a world center of cotton cultivation. Cotton was grown perennially in kinship groups and communities on a small scale across tropical West Africa, again, because this is the ideal climate for cotton to be grown in. And so, what happened over these thousands of years of West Africa creating this cotton culture was intricate textiles that were made from natural fibers, one of which was cotton, and that was cultivated over thousands of years through artisanal indigenous practices. And so, one such textile that we see all over the place now is mud cloth. And the Bambara word for mud cloth is Bogolanfini. And the Bambara people are an indigenous group that are sort of spread across modern day Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso. And so they developed this specific style of cotton textile called mud cloth. And so the process for this was that they also separated the seeds from the plant from the seeds by hand and or using a special comb, again, creating a tool to separate the lint from the seeds to make it more easy to cultivate. Then it was spun on a ceramic spindle. So again, they're using clay from the earth to create this tool to spin the cotton on, and then it was woven on looms, which we see being created across the world. Everyone is using looms to weave the cotton, and it was dyed with fermented mud and indigo, and then other plants. And this was the case across Central and South America as well, that indigenous people are using the plants that grow naturally in their region to dye these natural fibers, to dye the cotton cloth and create intricate colors, but also they're wefting and weaving in specific ways to create intricate designs. And this is all a reflection of culture. And so in the case of tropical West Africa, cotton was used for ritual use, for local and regional trade, as a form of currency, as a form of aesthetics. It was really a culture that used this natural fiber to think about the way that they express who they are, the way that they practice rituals that are important to them. And like most other indigenous people, it was grown alongside subsistence crops such as yam and corn. So across 3 continents, cotton spinning and weaving developed independently. Indigenous people grew cotton alongside other food crops in small batches. It was made into cloth for daily use and trade as well. So across indigenous cultures, cotton was part of their mythology. It was used in storytelling. It was used as an identity marker through clothing and expression through cloth and textiles and blankets. You hear about Anansi the spider in West African culture is teaching indigenous people how to spin cotton. In Aztec culture, there's also ideas about deities who taught them the skills that they needed to weave cotton, to create looms, to create spindles, to turn it into thread. And so Sven Beckert, who wrote Empire of Cotton, A Global History, says, fashioned by African, American, and Asian peasants, spinners, weavers, and merchants over at least 5 millennia, this cotton world was vibrant and expanding. Despite its diversity across 3 continents, the centers of this huge manufacturing industry had many things in common. Most important, cotton growing and manufacturing almost always remained small scale and focused on the household. So what's really important to know is that for the first several thousands of years that cotton was being independently cultivated around the world, it was only being done so in small batches and in communities or in the house. Even if it was used for trade or currency, it was done on a small scale. The practices of turning it into thread, of weaving it into cloth, were slow practices that took time and skill. This was a very slow cultural experience and was part of daily life. Cotton was not grown alone, it was grown next to food crops and other things they used. So, what's really clear is that for the most of the history of cotton, Europe or Europeans were non-existent or played a very marginal role. So we do know that there's some Italian weavers, Italian master weavers, some German master weavers in the 13th, 14th, 15th century who were mostly getting the raw material from the Ottoman Empire. And because Europeans couldn't grow cotton because of the climate, there was no way for there to be a cotton culture because they didn't have the resources necessary to actually grow the plant. So unless they were tapped into East Asian, South Asian, West Asian, East African, West African trade routes, which in most cases they were not tapped into, they didn't really have access to this plant, to this fiber. But European explorers and navigators had long known about cotton. Greek explorers would write about this plant that grows on trees that makes clothes really soft. Explorers would talk about these ornate Indian textiles. So Europeans knew about cotton and how important it was, but they couldn't actually insert themselves into these cotton trade regional routes that had existed, which is part of the reason why colonization came to be, to tap into some of these trade routes that Europe was largely left out of because of their marginalization and lack of resources. So this map is called the Gall-Peters map. And in the 19th century, a cartographer named James Gall created this map, which actually shows the size of continents relative to their area that they take up on the earth and relative to each other. So whereas the map that we mostly see in dominant society has the United States and Europe sort of in the center. They look a little bit bigger. The continent of Africa looks a little bit smaller. This Gall-Peters map shows actually how much area the continents actually take up. And when you look at it from this perspective, you see several continents, but Europe doesn't really fit all of the physical geographic parameters that we know a continent to be. So what we can understand through the history of cotton for the first several thousands of years is that Europe actually played a very small role. And even geographically, their role in the world is a lot smaller than we understand it to be today. And so the development of colonization also is important to note as we think about the fact that there was no cotton monoculture almost anywhere in the world before the 18th century. So what this means is that although indigenous people were cultivating cotton and growing cotton independently for thousands of years, there was almost no cases where cotton was purely being grown to sell for money or profit, or purely being grown to trade. It was always grown in small communities, in families for daily use alongside other crops. And so the intergenerational 1,000 years long history of cotton cultivation, harvesting, and artisanal weaving among indigenous Africans and Amerindians was invaluable to European colonialists who needed to over millennia, years of developing these skills that indigenous Africans and indigenous Amerindians developed through years of working with this plant and having a connection to this plant was so useful to Europeans who didn't live in a geography that could even support the cotton plant and had no history or legacy of working with the cotton plant. So I'm going to pass it over to Sha'Mira, who's going to talk a little bit more about this colonial intervention and the violence and commodification of cotton that was created as a result and how that resulted in plantation slavery in the colonial Americas.
Thank you, Teju. And yes, I'm Sha'Mira, and I thank you all for having me and engaging with our content. I currently reside on Creek and Cherokee land in Atlanta, Georgia. And as Teju has said, I'll take us through some of the historical foundations of cotton in the Americas. And so the history of cotton in the United States is both complex and racialized. To fully understand cotton from a historical perspective, both European colonization in the Americas and African enslavement must be contextualized. It's important to note here that slavery was a global enterprise. So while Western history books focus primarily on the institution of slavery in the US, I want to note that the transatlantic slave trade was only a segment of the global slave trade that transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from the 16th to 19th century. And if you look closely at this map, it implicates Europe as it should, and indicates that African people were also imported to areas such as the West Indies, Central America, and South America. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English, as well as the French, controlled about half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from the region of West Africa between Senegal and the Niger rivers and transplanting them in colonies that had been created in the Americas. And slave labor needs rose sharply in the 17th century with the rise of tobacco, sugar, and cotton plantations in all of the aforementioned colonies, but particularly in the southern US. The slave trade from Africa to the America technically ended in 1808. However, there was a domestic or internal slave trade involving approximately 1 million enslaved people being relocated from the upper South to the lower South. So when we think of slave auctions, it's often this second slave trade in which mothers were separated from their children, husbands from their wives, and families were torn apart to redistribute free labor in the states. And why? Because at this time, there was an unprecedented growth of the cotton industry globally, and the US needed to be involved in the global economy to expand itself. So it was on the back of cotton and thus on the back of slaves that the US economy ascended to the world. And we really consider, it's evident that the history of cotton in the US includes the hoarding of native land resources and the exploitation of slave labor. The Navajo and Hopi had been cultivating cotton in the southern US as early as 300 BC. And traditionally, cotton had been used by Native Americans for food and fiber for thousands of years. Digs at Snake Town along the Gila River in central Arizona have revealed that roasting cottonseed fragments dating back 1400 years. And prior to the widespread British colonization of the US, what is now Florida, we see American natives were known to grow cotton and use cotton out of necessity for food and weaving. As colonization persisted, there was little to no cotton grown in the US because there was a favor of British wool. However, during the takeoff of cotton production, there was an important shift for most native communities as Europeans displaced natives from their land to create slave-inhabited cotton plantations. Most of us are familiar with the Trail of Tears, which in 1838 removed the last of the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Choctaw, as well as the Seminoles from the region in the South that was known as the Black Belt, resettling them into what we call Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma. And if you ever wonder why this was necessary, in a word, it was cotton. Native Americans were living on what was perhaps the richest soil for crop production, and their removal created a scramble to settle their lands and raise cotton. And this led to one of the greatest periods in economic expansion and profitability in American history. Prior to the use of native lands for cotton, enslaved Africans in the US were brought to the country and were primarily used to produce staple crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and sugar. And there was virtually no cotton growth in the US due to the excessive amount of manual labor that it required. So the boll of the plant had to be picked by hand because no other gathering method had yet been invented. And it was a tedious task to, of course, walk the fields gathering the bolls, and even more tedious attempting to separate the dark color seed from the cotton lint. Separation of the seed was done at the end of the day, and typically only a pound or two of cotton lint was separated. For slave owners, 1 or 2 pounds of cotton was not considered a productive use of their slave labor until, of course, cotton became a global cash crop, which required exploitation of their slave labor. Additionally, Africans were already agriculturists themselves, as we've learned from Teju, and held the knowledge of the land that they had already toiled many generations, which meant that slave owners simply appropriated their skills and their knowledge of the land. Slavery also enabled the UK to dominate the cotton production and textile industry, which was previously dominated by India and China. The US saw this and simply shifted their priorities and crops. Through colonialism, the British also forced New World cotton seeds into West Africa to try to eradicate the use of their endemic seeds and centralize fiber cultivation, overshadowing traditional weaving and those indigenous practices that Teju told us about. Also, the aggressive war-based control of cotton allowed Europe to dominate the century-old worlds of cotton and centralize them to a geography that didn't even grow cotton like the US. And so cotton made the way for the first modes of manufacturing and factory organizations across Europe, ultimately creating profit for other segments of Europe's economy. And we know that cotton has 2 labor-intensive stages, in the field and in the factory, ultimately resulting in an increase of slave labor, Black bodies, and very low wage labor, poor white bodies. The former were largely dominated by Black women, who we have to thank for the fabric of our lives. Through all of this expansion, King Cotton, or cotton is king, was a common phrase used to describe the growth of the American economy. It was used to describe the plantation economy of the slavery states in the Deep South and to indicate that cotton was one of the world's first luxury commodities after sugar and tobacco. Cotton was extremely profitable and was interconnected with the economies of cotton plantations across the colonies and the northern banking industry, the New England textile factories, and a huge proportion of the economy of Great Britain. All of these areas overlapped. And in 1895, Cotton States and the International Exposition was held in what is now Piedmont Park in Atlanta, a few miles away from me. The exposition was designed to promote the American South to the world and showcase products and new technologies, as well as to encourage trade with Latin America. The event is really best remembered for the Atlanta Compromise speech given by Booker T. Washington to promote racial cooperation. That is, Southern Black folks should continue working for the white majority, especially in agricultural capacities, for the greater good of the US economy. And by the 1900s, about 1.5 of the entire human population was engaged in the cotton industry, either by growing, transporting, or manufacturing. As far as Caribbean cotton production, one reason why Columbus thought that he reached India when he made it to the Caribbean was because he saw cotton plants growing. He wrote in a letter back home that in colonizing this particular land, that they could get spices, cotton, which was highly valued, and slaves. So we see based on the language he used that the Taino, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, were already growing cotton. And Sea Island cotton, which is unique to the low country of the US now, actually originated in the Caribbean. In fact, genuine Sea Island cotton is grown in the Caribbean, primarily in Jamaica and the Barbados. We also know that Columbus landed in the Caribbean and claimed that region for Spain, but the Dutch, the French, and the British also followed one another to the region and established a long-term presence. They brought with them millions of slaves imported for Africa to support the tropical plantation system, including cotton plantations. And these plantations exploited the Caribbean landscape and created an agricultural dependency that is closely linked to European colonialism. The dependency altered the financial potential of the region by introducing a plantation system and not much else. Of course, this dependency was advantageous to the colonizing groups because Caribbean cotton was important to sustain early British industrialization, and the emergence of a global market for cotton textiles meant that these colonies needed to expand cotton plantations out of fear of losing to the US cotton supply. And the exploitation of the Caribbean landscape also caused significant environmental degradation to occur in areas of the Caribbean. The land is still suffering from exploitation from 500 years ago. So unfortunately, cotton production was halted for generations, which has meant that the Caribbean countries have not been able to compete globally in the cotton economy, despite its long-standing history with cotton, and that the countries have had to rely on imports. The first commercial cotton crop in 30 years was planted in Haiti, for example, in 2018, so we are seeing lasting effects here. And in Latin America, prior to colonization, cotton was already a staple crop for indigenous cultures. In fact, Peru, cotton textiles were regarded as sacred and indicated status and was used in rituals. In ancient times, cotton was valued more than gold or silver. Unlike the precious metals the Spaniards coveted, cotton threads or textiles signified a wearer's high social status and political power in parts of what's now considered Latin America. Spaniard colonization, however, similar to instances in the US and the Caribbean, commercialized cotton in more ways than one. The early Caribbean proved a massive disappointment for Spaniards. They had hoped to find mineral wealth in exploitable indigenous populations, but gold existed only in small amounts, and they killed off the indigenous people in massive numbers. Cane sugar was of high value, which was a focus crop, and cotton became a low bulk export product. So to compete, the colonies, of course, needed a labor force, which were African slaves and Chinese laborers. Cotton grown in South America had the characteristics necessary for producing finer yarns, and the Portuguese also capitalized during this time. More and more laborers were imported to the new colonies, and by the 18th century in Brazil, for example, the country ranked as one of the foremost cotton producing countries in the world. Between 1791 and 1801, Brazilian cotton represented 40% of raw cotton imports into Liverpool, rivaling those from the Caribbean and the US. Through Portuguese mediation, Brazil was able to increase its relevance to the British textile sector. And because there was an increased demand for calicos and muslins in Britain as the textile and fashion industries grew, more and more countries were interested in providing the cotton. Even after cotton exports began to increase from the US to Great Britain, Brazilian raw cotton remained the important way into the 19th century. And in 2002, Brazil, who was still a major cotton competitor, expressed its growing concerns about US cotton subsidies by initiating a World Trade Organization dispute settlement case against certain features of the US cotton program. And this just speaks to the historical relevance and the competition of cotton as an economic driver for countries. But the focus on cotton as an economic driver has significant implications.
And so a major implication of cotton production on this industrialized scale through monoculture was the impact on the physical environment, and alongside the impact on Black, Indigenous, Chinese bodies that were working the land. There was also the land itself that was suffering, as Sha'Mira mentioned in some of what she said about plantation slavery and how it existed throughout the Americas. So the first thing that needed to happen to make way for plantations was clearing the land. And this resulted in massive deforestation. So the forest cover creates climate stabilization by sequestering carbon and being home to biodiversity. And through clearing the land, there was less cover to protect against natural disasters. There was massive habitat displacement for hundreds of species and creatures that lived in that forest. And this was in order to create monocultural cash crops. It was for wood to build plantation houses and fences around the land. And so the clearing of the land was really the first part of the process that impacted the environment. Now, Indigenous peoples had cleared the land as well, because when they were cultivating their crops, they needed to clear the land, but a lot less land was cleared, and it was cleared in a way that allowed the forest to regenerate over time. So several Indigenous communities would travel throughout the region, and once they used up a part of the land, they would leave that land so that it could have some time to regenerate, the forest could regrow. So clearing the land had been happening before, but not on such a massive level. And so one of the other benefits of having African and Indigenous people as slave laborers is that they knew how to do some of these agricultural tasks that were required for plantation slavery, such as clearing the land. The other aspect of plantation slavery that was terrible for the environment was that it was monocultural. And what that means is that you're growing one crop on a large scale in order to sell it for profit, right? So it's not about subsistence and purely living off the land. It's specifically about the mass production of a crop so that it could be sold on the global market. And so monoculture increases pests because the habitats and the natural predators that lived in the forest had been displaced due to the deforestation caused by clearing the lands. The plants and the trees that these, what we call pests, would have been finding their food or where they would live or eat in, those are no longer there. So monoculture also increases pests. And then what happens with pests is you have to find different ways to deal with them, which further can degrade the environment. The other thing about mass producing cotton for profit is that it requires uniformity, which further intensifies monocultural practices across different geographies. So there's four main species of cotton from which hundreds of varieties come. The European colonialists specifically bred the G. hirsutum species of cotton, which is upland cotton, which we now call America upland cotton. And through colonization, Europeans introduced this species of cottonseed into agricultural cycles in West African parts of Asia, as Sha'Mira said. So it's not just that they're growing and breeding this specific type of cotton in the Americas, it's that they're also using their colonization through war and violence and domination in places on the continent of Africa and Asia to use these New World seeds as opposed to the indigenous upworld seeds that indigenous um, cotton seeds that they had been cultivating for thousands of years. And so as a result, right now, currently about 90% of the cotton grown across the planet is derived from this New World variety of G. hirsutum. So it's not just that colonization created plantation slavery and made the way for industrialization. It's also that the earth is forever changed as a result today because of the European colonialists pushing this seed onto every other geography in the world in order for them to be a part of this global cotton market that Sha'Mira described. Additionally, cotton specifically, when you're cultivating it on large scale, there is the opportunity to till too much. And so there was issues with excessive tillage and soil turnover, which resulted in widespread soil erosion, which hinders healthy soil aggregation. So because they're producing harvests again and again without enough time in between and tilling the soil a lot to plant the seeds and make sure they grow, in a very specific time frame, that created soil erosion. So across the southern United States, across parts of the Caribbean, soil erosion as a result of mass producing and cultivating cotton is a major issue that was created in terms of the environment. And so all of these practices led to the destabilization of the climate as we see it today, because there were less plants and forests sequestering carbon. So there's really a thread from colonialism to some of the climate change and agricultural issues that we see today. So for example, by the time Haiti won its independence from France in 1804, most of their land was no longer arable due to the monocultural practices of cultivating cotton, sugarcane, and coffee under French colonization and enslavement. One of the reasons that Haiti is the poorest country in, almost the poorest country in the world is because they were the first nation in the Americas to abolish slavery. They did that through beating France, who was already weak because of Napoleon's losses, and Napoleon lost millions of dollars trying to fight enslaved Africans and Haitians who were fighting against France. So they were really the first to defeat a colonial power, which spurred independence movements across Latin America. And the reason why Haiti had to pay billions, actually trillions of dollars back to France was because they were such an important and valuable colony for their cotton, sugarcane, and coffee cultivation. And so right now, Haiti only has 38.8% of land that is arable and suitable to grow food as a result of this history of agricultural degradation and then imperialism and domination that led to their debt and not being able to participate in the global market, even though they were one of the richest islands in terms of resources in the world. So it's not only that the history of cotton, specifically through colonialism and industrialization, has created violence and genocide against indigenous people and violence against Africans, as well as other peoples who were used as laborers. It's also that it degraded the environment and degraded some of these indigenous agricultural practices that actually regenerate the soil. And so today we're still feeling the effects of this environmental violence that the history of cotton cultivation through colonialism created. So cotton itself is not the problem. Colonialism made way for industrialized capitalism, and it did this through violence, destruction of indigenous people and practices, and the mass monocultural cultivation of cotton. So the problem was the social and economic structure European colonialists created to enrich themselves from one of the oldest, most useful plants in history. I'm going to pass it over to Sha'Mira again to talk a little bit more about this industrialization and the economic foundations that were created as a result of the mass cultivation of cotton in the Americas. So cotton cultivation and the production of it is now a large-scale global enterprise, and it's led to the Industrial Revolution and economic foundations of the West, as Sha'Mira will talk about in a second. And it was really through, on the graves of indigenous Amerindians and on the backs of enslaved Black people that the cotton production map now looks the way that it looks. And so in green, we see the main cotton producers currently. This map is from the 80s, so it's a little bit out to date. And we also see a couple main producers of naturally colored cotton, which is a lot less than it would have been thousands of years ago. And the producers of organic cotton, again, a lot less producers of natural organic cotton. There's some in the US, but it's still a very small movement, right? But organic cotton is still not the main form of cotton that's being produced. These sort of colonial production modes of industrialization, mass scale, chemical fertilization, excessive tillage are still part of the way that cotton is produced. And so it's still produced really unsustainably. And there's very few parts of the world where it is produced in a sustainable way using indigenous practices. And so when we look at this map today, we can see sort of the shifts that have taken place as a result of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade in regards to humans' relationships to cotton.
And so I'll talk about the US cotton production and the rise of fashion and textile culture in the US, because that is pretty much the rise of industrialization in the US. The international fashion industry was, like most things in America, built upon the backs of slaves. The contributions that slaves made to the cotton industry in the antebellum South laid the blueprint for success in America and abroad, as we've just learned. 400 years later, cotton remains a huge moneymaker and a major pillar of the fashion industry. Yet we know it's still cultivated by exploiting disenfranchised laborers around the world. History books continue to discredit this truth that slave labor, mostly in the cotton fields of the South, is behind one of America's first big business booms. That is the creation and rise of the fashion industry. While plantation owners in the South continued to garner insurmountable wealth from the cash crop, the slave labor behind their wealth enabled them to generate pure profits and accumulate generational wealth, which we know that Black nor Native or Indigenous generations have benefited from. Cotton emerged as the antebellum South's major commercial crop. It eclipsed tobacco, rice, and sugar in economic importance. By 1860, the region was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton. And in 1793, Eli Whitney revolutionized the production of cotton when he invented the cotton gin, a device that separated the seeds from raw cotton. Suddenly, right, a process that was like very, very labor intensive, when done by hand, could be completed quickly and easily. And American plantation owners who were searching for a successful staple crop to compete on the world market found it in cotton. So cotton drove the Industrial Revolution. The British textile industry included several fabrics, and before the revolution, the dominant one was wool. However, cotton was a more versatile fabric, and during the Industrial Revolution, cotton rose dramatically in importance, leading some historians to argue that the developments spurred by this burgeoning industry, technology, trade, transport, stimulated the whole revolution. And cotton was one of the first industries to introduce mechanical labor-saving devices and factories. So from slaves handpicking cotton to the cotton gin. And a demand for cotton already existed in the industrial textile mills in Great Britain. And in time, a steady stream of slave-grown American cotton would also supply northern textile mills. Therefore, we saw that Southern cotton picked and processed by Black American slaves helped fuel the 19th century Industrial Revolution, and in both the US and in Great Britain. What helped to fuel this process even more was the cotton gin. Eli Whitney, who was a recent Yale graduate, learned that Southern planters were in desperate need of a way to make the growing of cotton more profitable. Long staple cotton, which was easy to separate from its seeds, could only be grown along the US coast. And the one variety that grew inland had sticky green seeds that were time consuming to pick out of the fluffy white cotton bowls that were actually useful. So Whitney invented the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was a machine that could effectively and efficiently remove seeds from cotton plants. It worked something like a strainer or a sieve. Cotton was run through a wooden drum that embedded with a series of hooks that caught the fibers and dragged them through a mesh. And the mesh was too fine to let the seeds through, but the hooks pulled the cotton fibers through the mesh. For the South, the cotton gin meant that cotton could be produced more plentiful and cheaply for domestic use and for export. And by the mid-19th century, cotton was America's leading export. For the North, especially New England, cotton's rise meant a steady supply of raw materials for the textile mills. The cotton gin also strengthened slavery. Although the gin made cotton processing less labor intensive, it helped owners earn greater profits because it prompted them to grow larger crops, which in turn required more labor. And because slavery was the cheapest form of labor, cotton farmers simply acquired more slaves. The new technology also meant that additional labor could be redistributed. During this time, weaving mills began to appear on plantations, and so the same women who were toiling on the cotton fields were also trained in the craft of weaving. And Black women played a very important role in the development of textile production prior to and during the Industrial Revolution, beginning with the development of indigo production in the mid 1700s and then expanding to cotton. Black women began working in what was to become the early textile economy. These women became spinners, weavers, and dyers of the plantation South and the actual originators of a robust textile economy. This particular history is largely ignored in education, but significantly important. The knowledge and expertise that Black women held in the textile economy also contributed greatly to Black cultural production, including the Black quilting tradition. We know that Black slave women were needed for spinning, weaving, and sewing, also quilting in wealthy white households. And some of these women became highly skilled. Before the abolition of slavery, members of the Underground Railroad used quilts to mark escape routes and houses of refuge for runaway slaves. And during and after the Civil War, most quilts were made for everyday use and made from scraps of cotton fabric. Spinning, weaving, sewing, and quilting continued to be used as an art form to reflect family experiences of migration and settlement, for example, and the tradition has been handed down through generations and is still popular. The records of the textile industry include numerous materials related to its labor force during industrialization, of which women and immigrants constituted a large percentage. Women and European immigrants who were not yet considered white, such as the Italians, the Polish, and the Russians, worked in textile factories as the Industrial Revolution flourished. These factories were quite literally sweatshops, and many succumbed to disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Textile factories, and not solely consumer wants, or where the concept of fast fashion actually originated. Managers at textile factories and sweatshops equipped work areas with clocks and watches, which created a consciousness of time that was to be monetized. It became key how much production was completed in a specific amount of time. And there was an implied relationship between time, the synchronized work of industrial capitalism, and the embodied psychological capacity of people to lead a time-oriented life. And they were disciplined by the value of time. Thus, slave labor and low-wage labor as a commodity, cotton as a commodity, and time as a commodity became the arbiters of the fashion and textile culture in the US. And we still see this perpetuated in the current fast fashion market through modern day slavery, such as with prison labor and sweatshops abroad. And so to sum up the economic foundations of cotton in the fashion and textile industry, we saw US crops declining. Thus, British and other European nations colonized other geographic locations to meet the demand for cotton wanted for clothing. The British Cotton Growing Association was an organization that formed in 1902 from the various bodies connected to Great Britain, which aimed to reduce the industry's dependence on supplies of raw cotton from the United States. And it promoted the development of cotton growing within the British Empire. Operations by territory included Sudan, parts of West Africa, parts of South Africa, Iraq, West Indies, and also formed alliances with other countries such as France and Portugal, which contributed to the mass colonization that we discussed in previous slides. Cotton also propelled New York City to commercial preeminence and fostered independent trade between Europe and the US, which provided export capital for the US to gain financial preeminence in the world economy. For most of the 20th century, every aspect of garment making was located in New York, stemming from cotton factories, which made New York City a fashion capital of the world. And with more cotton being produced, we've seen a drop in cotton prices, consumer demand increased, and now we see an international commerce of cotton. And cotton has grown in more than 100 countries. It's heavily traded commodity with over 150 countries involved in exports and imports of cotton. And the 6 largest consuming countries are also among the top 7 producing countries. We know that cotton is a very political crop because of its importance in world trade and to the economies of many developing countries. In many countries, cotton exports are not only a vital contribution to foreign exchange earnings, but also account for a significant proportion of GDP and tax income. With all this popularity that cotton has, we have seen a lot of commercialization around it. And one aspect of that commercialization, before this lecture, you may have thought that cotton is so ubiquitous that it's almost invisible, and you're not wrong. Society has done a really good job with cotton's PR. It pretty much erases a racialized history, as some of y'all mentioned already in the chat. It namely excludes Black and Native Indigenous histories. It ignores colonizations and literal war and death of generations of people, and instead has perpetuated a clean, all-American persona, as evidenced by these particular ads I have here on the slide. There's a Spring Made ad for the Spring Cotton Mills factory on the left from the 1940s. The second ad is one, it says, "The look is cool, the fabric is cotton." And the last one I think is from 2016 of Zooey Deschanel, "The Fabric of Our Lives." We're all familiar with that. And you can see that all of these images are of white, able-bodied women, despite what we've just learned about cotton labor and Black women's role in it. They are all reminiscent of a persona known as the Gibson girl, which was pretty much the personification of the feminine ideal of physical attractiveness in the late 19th century. And even the most recent image alludes to that. The Gibson girl image went like this. You're a member of upper class society. You always are perfectly dressed in the latest fashionable attire. Your social status allows you to take time to look for personal fulfillment. So we can assume, based on these ads, that this is the story that hegemonic forces and powers want us to know about cotton, not all of the things that we've learned here in this lecture. Additionally, the Made of Cotton beauty pageant program advertised US cotton to the world stage. The beauty pageant was sponsored by the National Cotton Council, the Memphis Cotton Carnival, and the Cotton Exchanges of Memphis, New York, and New Orleans from 1939 to 1993. And the contest was held annually in Tennessee until it moved to Dallas, Texas. It was discontinued in 1993 due to lack of funds, a sponsor, and changes in marketing strategy, which was probably a return to the strategy that we just saw on the previous slide. And the pageant served as a symbol that reflected the values of American culture. Therefore, if you look critically at the Made of Cotton pageant and the advertisements that I showed, you can see that there are issues of beauty, femininity, cultural values, national identity, racism, and feminism inherent and entangled with cotton.
So we have just shared a lot of information about some of the histories of cotton and indigenous cultivation, colonialism, plantation slavery, industrialization, capitalism, all the way through to commercialization and PR. And I'm sure we all can think about our relationships to cotton right now. And so we wanted to end on a note of thinking about cotton futures. Since we're understanding this history and living this history, what are some of the futures of cotton? So cotton futures are Black and Indigenous people reclaiming and reframing dominant relationships to and mainstream narratives about cotton. Cotton futures are climate beneficial, organic cotton grown in a way that does not further degrade our environments or human life. Cotton futures are decentralized, decolonized, and decommodified, if possible. Cotton futures are regenerative, indigenous centric, geographically specific. Cotton futures are happening now. So I want to share some examples of the ways that cotton futures are happening now, the ways we can participate to create sustainable cotton futures, and the ways we could heal some of these violent legacies of domination, dispossession, and genocide that cotton in the Americas was built upon. The first company I want to bring your attention to is called Black Cotton. It was started by Julius Tillery, who is a fifth generation Black cotton farmer, of which there are not many, because through exclusion and lack of getting government grants, it's very hard and has been very hard for Black farmers to own land or maintain their farms. So it's really important when you do have intergenerational Black American cotton farmers. And Black Cotton says on their site, "We are a business that centers and uplifts the Black community closest to the cotton fields in Northampton County, North Carolina. We create genuine and distinguished home decor, jewelry, and accessories handmade with cotton that we cultivate and care for." So what we see with Black Cotton is a reclaiming of the legacy of Black people's relationship to cotton, the fashion industry, and decor, and aesthetics and taste. We see this geographic specificity, thinking about the Black community that's closest to these fields in Northampton County. And we see this sort of resilience and enterprise that Black people have had to have despite exclusion, violence that has taken place over the last few hundred years of cotton cultivation in the Americas and the United States specifically. Another organization that was featured on one of the open education courses that I taught is called Seed to Shirt. I love this organization. And on their website, they say, "Our vision was clear: to be a company that empowers people who've been traditionally marginalized, creates planet beneficial products and services, uses the profit for good, supporting programs that change the world." So Seed to Shirt is about creating a vertically integrated, sustainable shirt from the cotton seed to the end garment being the shirt. They work with Black farmers in the South. They work with Black farmers in West Africa, specifically in Burkina Faso. And they're really thinking about this circular notion of the seed, the cotton seed to the cotton shirt, and reclaiming Black people's relationship and really the Black diaspora's relationship and crucial place in the development of the cotton industry and the fashion industry today. So Seed to Shirt is sort of bringing together a lot of the things that we've mentioned today through creating sustainably made t-shirts through a Black diasporic supply chain. So they have worked with 8,400 African cotton farmers, which they've supported through their farmer enrichment program. More than 50% of the African cotton farmers they support are women. And as we know, women were really overlooked in the history of cotton, although they were really the main bodies that were working with the cotton and spinning it and weaving it and picking it. They work with over 100 diverse suppliers and small businesses. And so they're really thinking about the holistic, integrated, circular way of how we consume cotton through the garments and the shirts that we wear. Another organization that we featured in open education was Oshadi Collective. And Oshadi means essence of nature in Sanskrit. And they are also thinking about the circular seed to sew production of garments with natural fibers. Cotton is one of the natural fibers that they work with. They also use dye from plants and are really reclaiming the indigenous Indian practices of cultivating cotton, turning that cotton into fiber and creating beautiful, vibrant garments from that. And so Oshadi Collective has a regenerative farm in Tamil Nadu, India, and they are creating this circular seed to sew supply chain specifically for women's wear. Another company in India is called Tula, and Tula in Sanskrit literally means cotton. It is the word for cotton. And Tula brings to you garments from Indian cottons originally grown by smallholder, rain-fed farmers, with the yarn hand-spun by skilled khadi workers and colored with natural dyes, with the fabric woven on hand looms by master weavers, with the garments stitched by women and men from economically and socially marginalized groups. So again, on Tula's websites, they're talking about the process of growing cotton in a way that is regenerative and good for the earth. They're talking about these ancient indigenous practices of using hand looms and working with weavers and using natural dyes. They're bringing back this indigenous practice in cultivating cotton and creating the fabrics and the garments that we wear, and especially recognizing that through colonialization, these indigenous practices, these Indian and African and Black and Asian farmers and artisanal weavers were sort of marginalized once the global market centralized around Europe and the US. And so Tula is sort of reclaiming this narrative, this relationship to cotton. So cotton is one of the most important plants and fibers in human history. The history of cotton is still unfolding. We all contribute to cotton futures and the cotton present. Understanding the links between cotton, indigeneity, colonialism, and capitalism can help us create more sustainable cotton production in the long run, which is what we all want to do because cotton is so important to our lives, so important that we sometimes take it for granted and forget that almost every aspect of our daily life is interacting with this plant, this fiber, the fabric of our lives, if you will. So I hope you had some time to process that information. We're gonna answer some questions in the last 15, 20 minutes, we'll see. Thank you so much for listening. And as we said, we will send some references afterwards so you can read some of the books we read some of the articles, and think more about cotton. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and go to the Q&A.
Rebecca Ballard wants to know, what is your take on the linkage, if any, between slavery during the transatlantic slave trade and the present situation with human trafficking in the global garment industry?
There's definitely a link. It is my position is that we learn from history, right? And we take some of the good and some of the bad. And the current forms of slavery are definitely taken from what was learned through the transatlantic slave trade. It just goes down to free and cheap, very, very cheap labor and exploitation. And because at this point, a lot of the world operates in a capitalistic society. And we know that slavery is linked to capitalism, it's linked to colonialism. There's always going to be that linkage in that connection. There's actually a book by I think it's a guy Edelman from I think 2015 or 2016, is called What Caused Capitalism, and it goes through the history of the transatlantic slave trade into the current forms of slavery that we see abroad and sweatshops. I know there's another question about that, what connections are to the fashion industry. That would be a good resource.
This anonymous attendee wants to know, do either of you have perspective on the implementation of recycled cotton in the fashion industry, as opposed to the continued use of virgin cotton? How does this fit into quote unquote cotton futures?
I don't know if you're referring to like recycled cotton in the fashion industry for clothes or industrial use. So there's a couple of ways that you can recycle cotton. It can be, well, for the fashion industry anyway, it can be used to revert cotton fibers in other textile products, which they usually call regenerative or reclaimed cotton, or it could be used as like for industrial, for in your walls, for insulation and things like that. And I think those are great. I think we should recycle as much as we can recycle. I think that those are excellent. But one of my main issues with the fashion industry is that we typically do like a corporate social responsibility effort or a green effort to push consumers to buy more. So we might call something recycled or sustainable or regenerative, but you're still buying more of that thing though, and you might get rid of it and buy more of that thing again. So I think that these are great. These recycle programs are amazing, but I also think that as consumers, we should think critically about just how much we're buying in general, and why these things need to be recycled and regenerated in the first place. If we weren't consuming as much, then we wouldn't have to be doing these like these programs as much, right? So I think, like I said, they are great, but also let's not buy too much of these.
Yeah,
And again, oh, I was just going to say another open education class, waste as a form of, as a result of colonialism. Soul Factory has a course on that. So that talks a little bit more about like just this idea of needing to recycle because waste was created in the first place.
This person wants to know, how do you folks think educating younger people, kids and youth, would make a difference in this mess of a textile system?
Sha'Mira, do you want to start since you're in the academic field?
Yes, I can start. So this is actually part of my pedagogy and teaching. I'm in a PhD program and I teach the Intro to Fashion Merchandising courses at the university I'm at. And so a lot of my pedagogy is this unlearning process and reifying actual history. And I can say from firsthand account that students want this information. And as someone who's educating the future fashion professionals that that will be making decisions, that they'll be designers, they'll be in the economic sector, they'll be buyers. Them learning this information at the stage that they're learning in is critical and crucial to them being able to actually change the system as a whole. When I talk to my classes, I don't refer at the fashion industry as the fashion industry because that's just it's too middle ground for me. I call it the fashion industrial complex because I want them to understand that it is very much like the prison industrial complex. There are a lot of different moving parts. There's a long history that's racialized. There are components that they have not been able to learn because white supremacy and colonialism makes you forget things, right? It makes us history. We tell it in a way that we think is the correct way, and it is not. So teaching particular content like this is 100% crucial and necessary for the generations that are coming into industry professionals.
And we're all socialized and indoctrinated into the system from the time we were born. So I also think that it's important to talk about these issues with little humans because they are humans in this society. And so sometimes they're like, oh, can I tell the kids about this thing? But it's like little Black kids are living in colonialism, capitalism, and racism every day. They don't have a choice about whether they learn about it or not. They learn about it from the experience in their bodies. And so it's important that we're teaching kids these sort of structures. If it's an industrial complex, which most of our societies are, particularly in the West, and that sort of determines how we interact with other geographies, then little humans need to know about it because they are living in this industrial complex. And some of the ways they may feel uncomfortable are not natural. They are unnatural. They are designed. They are by design. And so by letting kids know that these are the structures that we live in, some of the ways that they may feel uncomfortable in their bodies or the way that they feel oppressed by society makes sense. And so a lot of times by not talking to kids about these things, we can gaslight their experiences. Like, I remember being a little queer kid and being like, so I'm not supposed to be this way, but I am this way. But if you look at some indigenous cultures with two spirits or whatever, like there are all these different ways of being that have existed. And so by letting kids know that this is the structure that we live in, but there are all these other different ways of being that exist and have existed, I think it gives them the opportunity to start creating a world that they want to live in that is not the world that we currently live in. So I think it's really an opportunity, and that we shouldn't shield children from these conversations. Are we going to talk the same way that we've been talking to y'all today? No, but we're still going to talk about these things. And I was really grateful, and have been lucky to have parents who talk to me about these things. My mother is Jamaican, so I grew up Jamaican American, and we very well understand colonialism, right? My father's Black American, and so we very well understand settler colonialism. And so there's all of these ways that my parents talk to me about these things by talking about our identity, how I feel, and then the external perception of my identity. And I think fashion is a huge invitation because we all wear clothes. We all wear clothes. We all use towels or blankets. So this is really the most tangible way to teach kids about the world, is by what is this made out of? Where does this come from even? Yeah. So thank you all so much. Our contact information is all over the Soul Factory's Instagram and page. So feel free to reach out for us and tag us on Instagram. And just really grateful to Sha'Mira for doing this with me, and all of your expertise. And so, yeah, happy Friday to everyone. I'll turn it back over to Truman.
Thank you so much, Teju and Sha'Mira. That was absolutely incredible. And truly, with that last question, I could not have stated it any better myself. And it's why you guys are the teachers and I'm not. So thank you both so much. We truly appreciate it. Thank you, Veronica. As always, we're going to have resources put on the Slack after this, and we'll keep the conversation going in Slack. Be sure to tune in next week. And just a reminder, if you feel like sharing anything you've learned today, especially if it's direct quotes from Sha'Mira or Teju, please source them, credit them, tag them. Anything you've learned from Slow Factory, directly tag us, credit us, and we can continue the conversation online. And thank you all so much for tuning in today. It's been an incredible class, and we'll see you all next week.